Our guest today is William Knoedelseder. Full disclosure, he's a friend of mine, so going to be calling him Bill, William, a little interchangeably. Bill worked at the LA Times from 1977 to 1989, where he was part of the whole music industry payola situation, helped to kind of blow that up, and that resulted in his book Stiffed, a true story of MCA, the music business, and the mafia. His latest book is called Bitter Brew, The Rise and Fall of Anheuser-Busch and America's Kings of Beer, of which he has already been to Google to speak about. You may remember that, and that is on the YouTube channel. In 2010, I'm Dying Up Here, Heartbreak and High Times in Stand-Up Comedy's Golden Era was released, which is now a Showtime show, and that's what we're going to talk about today. So, without further ado, please welcome back to Google, William Knoedelseder. The book, I have to say, Bill, is an amazing document of the rebirth and transformation of American stand-up comedy. So again, thank you for being here. I feel like it's kind of an on the road or maybe electric Kool-Aid acid test for comedians, or at least people interested in stand-up comedy. But I'm going to throw you a real softball here first, but it's an important softball. Bill, what is the biggest difference between your book and the show I'm Dying Up Here?
Mine is true. And theirs is fictionalized, based on the real events, but they didn't do the real characters, and there's a reason for that. And I wasn't surprised, and I was supportive of that. The story in the book basically takes place in about a year and a half's time. Okay, and it involves all these real life guys and women, mostly guys, who went on to considerable fame and fortune. But the TV series, they want the TV series to be on for 5 years, and so do I. So, they had to be able to have the creative license to make up things, and they didn't want to have things coming out of David Letterman's mouth at age 27 that David Letterman didn't say. So to keep it tightly to the story in the book limited the ability to have 5 years worth of material. So that's what they do. That's a normal thing in Hollywood. So, but that would be the big difference. You're not going to see David Letterman or Leno or any of the guys and gals who are in the book,
We see some, like Johnny Carson, or
right,
certain
Carson,
people are...
He's the only person, Richard Pryor. They have a Richard Pryor in
Let's
there.
Make a Deal host guy,
Oh, yeah.
Monty Hall. He's real, though.
Yeah, that's right. But it's, and I could sit there and see all myriad things that they got from the book that are so-and-so said, but they're coming out of this character's mouth, and it happened this way in the book, but they've changed it to this. And the world that they create and the relationships they create are all accurate. I mean, they're all from that world in that time,
Yeah, it seemed like they sort of, I noticed that some things that were maybe the same character, they would take those anecdotes and spread them among two separate characters, or this character, this happened to him, and now this other thing happened to him from another, but it still all kind of works.
What and their idea going into this, I knew this from the outset, was that they wanted, this was Jim Carrey's idea, that he went through this same system of club comics out here, the same place. He went through about 10 years after the events in the book. And he was fascinated by doing a TV series about the dark side of comedy, and there is definitely a dark side to these people who get up and on a stage like this with a microphone, and they try and get that audience to love them, and they bring a lot of baggage to the stage. There's a reason that they were compelled to do that. So that all comes out. So their idea was that it was going to be the dark side of comedy. That was the way they kind of sold it to the network. So it's a little darker than my book, but that's fine. I mean, when the book, when the real events took place, 30 years ago, you didn't see comics everywhere all the time. Comics weren't ubiquitous. Matter of fact, the only place you saw comics in America is you saw them on the Ed Sullivan Show, or you saw them on the Johnny Carson Tonight Show. That was it. And if they didn't get on those shows, they didn't have a career. And if you wanted to see a comic live, you had to go to two clubs. One was in New York and one was here. And there were no videotapes that were being sent around. There was no channel to watch comics on wall to wall. So it was a much smaller profession, and they were, young and desperate to get, in front of some sort of media so they would have a career and they could make money being funny. And it wasn't as easy. Not that it's easy now, but there's certainly much more,
few more
outlets
avenues
than there was back then.
Yeah, it seemed they definitely captured, I think, in the show the sort of the control that Goldie or Mitzi,
Exactly.
Goldie's kind of a real person in the show too,
Right,
although the
right.
name's just changed, right?
Exactly, right.
But where she doesn't even pay them at first, and she's like, "Look, this is access to Carson, and that's what you're getting here."
Well, that's how it worked. What happened was, the history of this was, and my role in it was, I was, a junior reporter at the Los Angeles Times, and my editor called me in one day and said, there's something going on here with these young comics here in town that feels like Greenwich Village in the, the 1960s, and would you like to cover the comedy beat? So he decided that we would have a comedy beat. When I was, I was the exact same age as all these people, and I thought, there's going to be a comedy beat for the LA Times, and I'm going to get to cover it. And so it was like the dream job, because they were all 26 or 27. And what happened was, in 73 or 74, the Carson Show, which was the only place you could see comics, he decided he wanted to live in California. He didn't like New York, so he moved the show to Burbank. And what happened was that all the comics lived in New York because you had to be someplace where the talent scouts for the Tonight Show walked into the club and saw you and said, yeah, you can be on the show. Well, you could hear the suitcases of all the class clowns unpacking. The minute he moved out here, they literally, there was this invisible immigration of class clowns that just within a couple years packed up, left home, and came out and moved into crappy little apartments in West Hollywood, and they formed this sort of community. And I got the amazing job of, okay, you cover that, find out what's going on with those people, because it's a really unusual art form. Who's happening? Who's funny? What's different about them that's different from the other guys, the Bill Cosbys and the Bob Newharts? What's different about these people, and who's going to happen next, and all that? That was my job, and I got to sit there and right there in the front row, as all these people walked up on the stage, sometimes for the first time, and tried to make people laugh, and it was the best gig I ever had,
Sounds pretty awesome.
So yeah, it was great. So 30 years later, here you are still talking about, because at the time, my editor, who was my mentor, he's passed on now. He had a sense that there was something meaningful going on, and there was something really meaningful going on. I didn't realize at the time, because I was fresh from St. Louis, my first gig. They were trying out a whole new kind of comedy that wasn't just setups and one-liners and the stuff that you saw, Bob Hope do. Bob Hope never made me laugh one time in my life. I would watch him and, just never chuckled once. So these kids were making up new stuff, and they were talking about sex and their mothers and blah, blah, blah. And it was all a different kind of humor. And
It's that transition from like the suit comic,
Well,
like
exactly,
Carlin in the suit to Carlin in the sweater.
Exactly, yeah. Carlin changed the thing right in mid-sentence, and Richard Pryor did too. I mean, they had both been the suit comics on, and they would do the traditional jokes. They were doing, the big guy was Bill Cosby and Bob Newhart. It was routines, and they were funny. But they didn't relate to people who were 10, 12, 15 years younger than them. They didn't. And the other thing was that, and this comes into play in the show now, they did pick up on this. At the time, in America, young women weren't class clowns. I was never in a class where the girl was the funny one. It was always the guy. They weren't given license to be funny and speak up in class, and they didn't have any role models. With the role models they saw, they would see these older women who were did this self-deprecating, harried housewife camera, and it didn't relate to them at all. So they didn't really want to be comics. So there wasn't a wealth of people, women packing up their bags and moving to Los Angeles. There was, at one time we calculated that in 1978, when I started doing this, there was 300 stand-up comics in Los Angeles. Well, that's the most stand-up comics that at that point had ever been anywhere, and probably 20 of them were women. That's the ratio was that the discrepancy was that big. So it was a guy thing, and they get that in the show. That's one of the things they cover in the show.
The character Cassie seems almost like a cross between like Elaine Boozler and Sandra Bernhard or something, at least with the struggles of the women back then.
Right, yeah. I think it's mostly, since in the show, she's the only woman who's among that would be Elaine, because she was the only woman among the group of guys that went to Canners and all that. So that's all fairly accurate, although she's not at all like Elaine, but
No, but right. But again, they're fictional characters.
But it doesn't matter to the audience. They didn't see Elaine. So.
I thought they did a really good. You mentioned all the suitcases coming across the country. I think they did a good job with. I think the actors Clark Duke and his friend, but the two guys from Boston.
Oh yeah, well, but that was
sleeping in the closet.
You know how it works. They have these two characters, and they made them two guys. They come from Boston, but all the background that you see of them is why they leave Boston and what they're doing in Boston. That's Jay Leno. That's Leno's playing in the combat zone with strippers on the stage and all that. That was they took Leno's background from the book and then gave it to these two characters because it served their dramatic needs more than just one guy, I guess. I mean, I'm not part of the show. My job was to write the book and accept money for that, and from them, and I was happy.
It's a good job.
Exactly.
But what is it like? Can you take us through a little bit of like, you wrote, the book comes out in 2010, and I know you mentioned to me a long time ago that Jim Carrey had optioned the rights. So at least, can you tell me like what happens from that point? What happens?
The whole 30 year
what happens? No. What happens when they option your book, and what happens from there? Like, did you speak to Jim Carrey at all?
No,
I also know that he played Andy Kaufman in Man in the Moon, and you have an Andy Kaufman connection.
Oh, yeah,
But you never worked with him on that.
No. The way it worked was that the book came out. I can't remember when the book came out, and they very quickly optioned the book. And when optioning a book means they pay you so that they can then hold the rights while they go out and try and make a deal, okay? And then nobody else is trying to sell it, so they pay you, some amount of money. It's not usually a very much amount of money. And so then, and I found out, this is my first experience going all the way through the process. I've since had it happen, again, but this is my first ride. How long it takes to get everything that you need to get together to get something on television. Somebody has to be willing to sign on to be the showrunner and do all this, and maybe spend the next 4 or 5 years of their life doing this at the price that they're being offered, and the network has to, and it literally took, I guess, 4 years for them to set up a thing at Showtime. And then it took another year. So it was all total 6 years, I think, from the time the book came out to where we are now.
Yeah.
Or maybe more.
7, I think.
7.
It's a long time.
Yeah, it's a long time.
Wow.
Fortunately, I had other things to do, and I didn't have to. And it wasn't my headache, because I didn't have to deal with any of it. They were just off doing it, and they had to go hire all these people, and it's a difficult thing to do. They have to hire people who can write bad comedy intentionally. A bad comedy in 1970, so it has to be authentic, But these are supposedly young comics, doing stuff and bombing on stage. Well, someone's got to write that, and you got to be able to get what they were going after and why it missed, or it doesn't make sense. So I can't imagine doing that. That's a very hard thing to do.
Yeah. I'd like to go back a little bit to your time at the LA Times and during this era that is touched on in the book, but I've only seen 3 episodes so far. I'm not sure if they bring this in, but talk to me a little bit about Andy Kaufman and how you got to basically ride shotgun during his experience with Tony Clifton.
My job, as I said, was to go find out who was the next big person. I mean, I was there the first night, Robin Williams, broke big. I mean, and nobody had ever seen anything quite like that. He jumped up on stage, and everybody's mouths just dropped, and he was up there doing this stuff, and it was like, oh my God. There was no template for that. And there was no template for what Andy Kaufman was doing. And so they were all coming out, arriving. Andy came from New Jersey somewhere, Colts Neck or White Plains or something like that, came out of nowhere, and he was just bizarre. And he did it on a stage, but he wasn't a stand-up comedian. He did performance art, and so, I wanted to he had a character who was an alter ego of his that he had never admitted was his character, and his name was Tony Clifton, and he was this terrible, abusive lounge singer. And Andy portrayed him, and he would go on stage, but he would always deny that that was him. It's just, it takes a kind of personality to make that work with everyone and never break character, even though you all know it's really him. He would never admit it. And when he was on the show Taxi, he convinced the executive producer of a hit network show to hire Tony Clifton in a role. And you understand, it's not me. I just know Tony. He's telling these Hollywood producers in the studio, okay, so they think this might be a funny bit, so they hire Tony. And Andy was a vitamin-gulping, vegan, non-smoking guy. And Tony was, as Tony, he was a whoremongering, drunken, porno-consuming asshole, all right? So they hired Tony, okay? And, of course, Andy was off that week, and they hired Tony, and he was going to portray a character on the show with the rest of the cast. Now, the rest of the cast wasn't okay with this because Tony was an asshole, okay? And he had a trailer out and back, and he drank all day, and he had hookers in the trailer. And he was abusive to all the women because that was the character. So it was really untenable, and they decided they couldn't talk to Andy because Andy wouldn't admit that he was Tony. So they had to fire Tony. These are executive producers of a major hit show down at Paramount, on the Paramount lot, who are like going, what do we do? Okay, we'll fire Tony. We'll just let him go. And his cast, Andy's cast, they're furious at this guy because he screwed up everything. And so, of course, Andy's, got something going on here. He tells his manager to call up the guy from the LA Times because I was the LA Times guy who covered comics, and they wanted to get in front of me really badly because I'd write about them and they'd be in the LA Times. So I was important. So they invited me. They said, something's going to happen on the set today. And they made sure that I was there. And I didn't know what it was, but, I was doing a story. I was in the middle of doing a story on Andy. I went down and I had my camera, and I'm sitting there in the stands, as this whole thing unfolds. Tony comes onto the set where they're all getting ready, and they're all over the other players are all there glowering at him, and he's got these two hookers, and he's reeking of booze, but he's got presents for the whole staff, and he's handing them out, and the executive producers, tell him he's fired. Okay, Andy, I'm saying it's not Andy, it's Tony. I forgot. They fire him, and he goes crazy. And they have to call in the security guards, and he starts fighting him. And I'm sitting there with my camera, so I just start taking pictures of this. And they struggle to get him out in the alley, and I'm out in the alley taking pictures, And then the security guards set upon me and grab my camera and take my camera. I mean, this is, And they haul Tony, and they literally throw him off the lot. And I'm sitting there without my camera, and I want to sign for the LA Times, and they've confiscated my camera. I get it back. And, and that was it. I mean, that's how they got rid of Tony Clifton. But the pictures that I took still are on the internet, and they're famous now. I get a call once, twice a year. Somebody realizes that I own the rights to that picture. Can they buy the rights to reprint the picture, a famous picture of Andy Kaufman as Tony Clifton being thrown off the lot of Paramount? But, it was bizarre. And then what happened was after that, they called me. Somehow Andy's people got my camera back from the guards, and they said that Tony would like to meet me that night, okay? Just the two of us. And I said, that's fine. Okay, we'll do that. So I met Tony, at this bar on, I think it was on Hollywood Boulevard, some sleazy bar. Oh, no, I met him at a motel on Sunset.
Wow.
Kind of a hooker motel, oh, my God. And we went for a drink across the place that I picked, and he started hitting on the owner's daughter, this guy who was going to kill us, But Andy would not break his character at all. He wouldn't. He just stayed with the guy, with Tony. And I finally had to leave because I thought that we were going to get in really bad trouble, and that was fine. I was a journalist, but I don't have to go to jail with him to get the story.
Right.
Go ahead. That was it. So so I wrote that story up, and then of course some of that I guess ended up in the book years later with Jim Carrey.
Yeah, and there's, didn't he perform for you at your house as well?
Yeah, get more handy. While I was prepared, before this evening happened, so I knew Andy was on. I was going to interview him for this profile. I was going to do the first big major newspaper profile on this guy named Andy Kaufman. The world really didn't know about. They knew something about him, but not much. He had just appeared on this TV show. So he was a guy on a TV show, but nobody really knew what he was other than that weird character. So I was going to interview him, and a couple nights before that was to happen, a couple days before, I get a call at 7 o'clock at night, 8 o'clock, whatever it is. Hi, this is Andy. Can I come over? You know, and to my house? Yeah, okay. I said, well, yeah, okay. You know, so he shows up a half an hour later. He comes walking into my house, this crazy comic, with a suitcase full of, like an old vaudeville suitcase full of clothes. And he proceeded to do his whole act in pantomime out on my patio. And then he would go change into another outfit and then come back out and do the whole, oh, yes, oh, yeah. I'm waving this around. I'm supposed to be talking into it. Imagine that. So anyway, that was another bizarre thing, you know. And then he left. So you know, so I became sort of the resident world expert on Andy Kaufman for years. And the weird thing is that, you know, I have a son who's 25 who has a picture from that night where the rest of the night that he was on my patio, he changed into his wrestling outfit and he wanted to wrestle my wife, who was then 8 months pregnant. Okay, and I have a picture of him, you know, and she was like 5 feet tall and pregnant, and he wanted to wrestle her. So the pictures from that night are on my son's wall in his room. And every time one of his new friend comes in, they go, "Whoa, here's the picture of Andy Kaufman." I wouldn't have imagined that anyone 25 would know who Andy Kaufman is. No, they all know who Andy Kaufman is, and they cannot believe that Colin's dad actually knew Andy Kaufman, actually had an encounter with him, because he's that legendary.
Well, no one believed him when he got
exactly,
sick.
Exactly.
It's crazy, right?
Right. Yeah. No. People still think he's still alive. You know. So anyway, but
thanks for sharing that part with me.
Yeah, that's my one of my brushes with fame.
I think I even saw on maybe Don Cheadle's Twitter or something where it's a caricature of like Donald Trump, but he's pulling off a costume.
Right.
And
Yeah.
it's actually Andy
Kaufman. Yeah. Right.
Yeah.
No, he definitely did die. The weird thing was he died of some kind of lung cancer or something like that. And he didn't smoke, didn't drink, you know, and had vitamins lined up in his kitchen, like, you know, for miles. So just goes to show you, be careful.
For sure.
I think it was vitamins that killed him.
Too many vitamins. Maybe.
Yeah.
You talked about Robin Williams, seeing him before he blew up, before Mork and Mindy, right?
It was right at that time. He wasn't really imprinted. I think it was like a week or two before that hit, when he was just like a normal guy. And then it became huge because if you think about it, the way things are now, Mork and Mindy was the TV show that he went on. He was unknown. Mork and Mindy was watched every week by 57 million people. That's the kind of audience. A hit show now, you have 10 million people. They got 57 million people. You know, so he became so famous so fast. It wasn't like he got recognized when he went out on the street. He would get mobbed out on the street. And 2 months before, he'd just been some comic working at the Comedy Store for free, you know. Well,
and Richard Lewis also had a big part in the book, and you're friends with him. And
I got to know Richard pretty well. You know, I got to know some of them. You know, they were different. They were, you know, I was a journalist and they were the performers. So there was a.
His story is pretty central in the book, though, with his friend Steve and whatnot. And I see them working parts of that also into the show, but in different ways.
Right. Yeah. Well, that was a storyline. The thing about the book, the way it happened was I did all this. I covered this whole thing for a couple years, and then there was an event that happened in mid-1979. There was a tragedy occurred to one of this group of people, and it was really upsetting. But it was an amazing story. And after that was done, I'd been doing it for a year and a half, and I literally asked my editor. I said, I feel like I'm done with this. You know, I feel like I'd rather move on to another. Because it was getting kind of heavy. Because it was real. They were trying really, really hard. A lot of them were living in cars, and they were broke, and it was a very emotional thing. And I was seeing the dark side of it. You know, they were so desperate, and there was a lot of, and they would call me at the middle of the night and want to talk, and they were, you know, and they were very funny. But you know, there was a sad side of it that sort of, you know. So I asked, you know, off the comedy beat, I was probably put on the organized crime beat, which was a relief, you know. You know, I was like, oh, they have so many less problems. You know, they're just brutal. They're direct about it. Okay, they're brutal. That's all right. So yeah. But then what happened was, but that story, the story about what happened, was a big story that people remember years later. And I'd have somebody mention it because we did a really big long form article in the calendar section, which had never been done before. And I always remembered it as a big thing in my career because it kind of kicked off my, sort of narrative career. And then one day, about 27 years after all that happened, I was reading the paper and I saw an obit of a comedian named George Miller? George Miller, yeah, George Miller. See, you forget a name like
That's why I'm here, Bill.
You forget a name like Miller.
Yeah.
It's so forgettable. Yeah. And George had died, and I remember George because he'd been a source of mine back when all this stuff was happening, and he was a great guy, and it said that he'd been he was, and I knew George back at the time. He was David Letterman's best friend. And they lived right across from the street from the Comedy Store and all that. And the article said that they were having a public memorial for him at the Laugh Factory on Sunset on Sunday. So I thought, wow, you know what? I'm going to go to that. Because I hadn't seen those guys in years, and we were all the same age. We were all 26, 27 years old. So years later, one of them died, and I thought that maybe they'll all come back. It'll be like a big chill moment. And so I went over there on a Sunday afternoon, and sure enough, they all did. All of a sudden, all these people came walking back in, Richard, and the only one who, Leno, and they were, now we're all 50, and a little thicker and gray hair. But to a person, when they got up to talk about George, this guy that they had known for all these years, every one of them, their reference point was this 4-year period between 1975 and 79 when they were all working at the Comedy Store. Some of them in the room had gone on to live huge lives and make millions of dollars, and, we recognize wherever they go. But the time of their life that they remember were these 4 years when they were working, on this strip here with this crazy little woman who owned the club, who had dominion over their lives, and they were making no money and they were struggling. Looking back, that's when they became who they are. That's what they think. And they all talked about that 4 years. All their memories were settled, and I left there that afternoon and thought, wow, boy, there's a really great book in this. Because looking back on that now as they do middle-aged people, through the rosy glow of memory, they have a much better perspective on what happened back then. Back then, they were all just going through it. Now they had, so I literally, I sold the book like that to my publisher, and everybody who I talked to at 27, I was talking to at 55, and, it was a great story.
And you were able to go back and talk to
right. So the whole thing was, I researched the book for 30 years, basically, is what that's, and then it all sort of came together, and it was fairly easy to write. Because I knew, and I still had notes from 27-year-old Richard Lewis from an interview I did back on my back porch in 1979. Because I kept all that stuff. So it was a great experience being able to do that.
One other name I just want to mention before we get a little more current is someone I wasn't too familiar with until I read the book was Tom Dreesen.
Tom Dreesen, yeah.
And he sort of became like the
he's sort of the hero of the book.
Yeah.
Tom was a comic who was a few years older than most of them. He'd come from a very poor background, where a lot of them were upper middle class kids, went to college, and they were all college graduates and all that stuff. So Tom was 3 or 4 years older, and he'd grown up really poor and kind of worked his way up, and he was married and had a family. And so they were 27 and Tom was 32, 33. So he was like a father figure to a lot of them. He was making money and all that. So what happened? I have to talk about the strike. What happened is after a couple years of working for Mitzi Shore at the Comedy Store, and she didn't pay him. The idea was, no, this is not a place to get paid. This is I give you my stage and you get hired in the business. So you work for me for free, and that's one of the things that's in the TV series that they build on, and they were willing to do that because that was true. If you got on the stage at the Comedy Store, like Freddie Prinze did one night, the next week he had a TV series and he was rich and famous. So that's what they were all doing. So she didn't pay him. But as 300 people, converged on town. Not all of them got famous, and the rest of them were out here working for nothing, and they were desperate, and they were eating out of dumpsters and living in their cars and selling this and doing, and it got kind of so. And actually it was Leno who sort of broached the idea one night. They had just all been played on a New Year's Eve at the main room, and there had been all these people, and Mitzi had made all this money, and he said, shouldn't we get paid for this? Shouldn't we start doing, it took 4 of us to pack the room, but, we packed it. And so he started talking, and he didn't need the money. He was making money. So what they did was they formed a quasi-union, and the leader of it, the guy who was the oldest guy Tom, you tell him, he was Tom Dreesen. He became the spokesman, and he became the leader of the insurgency that went to Mitzi and asked for, can you pay us? Can you pay us $5 a set? And no, she refused to do it, and she kept refusing, and then finally they realized that the only thing they could do, they could keep asking and getting refused, or they could throw a picket line around the place and go on strike. So that's what she did. And for me as a reporter, I'd been covering these guys as artists, and comedians, and it was all fun and games and all that. And all of a sudden there was a story that comedians are going on strike at the Comedy Store. They have picket lines, and it was kind of funny, a funny idea, So I went over to cover it, and all the networks were there, and they all covered it for a day or two, and then they went on because they covered it for the goof of it, Here, the comics are down there, they're picking, Then they moved on, but they still had the situation, and they had all risked their careers by doing this because she was going to punish them. They kind of figured. And that's when the incident occurred that I won't tell you about because I don't, if you...
Yeah, don't ruin the book.
Yeah, I don't know if you're going to read it, but if you do read it, you'll be happy that I didn't tell you. And Dreesen sort of, it's his legacy, and he did something, and now when Tom, he tells me all the time, because of the book, he'll be out, Tom works all the time, and he'll be out, and some young comics will go up with him and say, man, I got paid the first time I walked on stage thanks to you because you went on strike back then and you got us paid. I don't get paid a lot. They actually get paid less now than they got paid after the strike, but they get paid. So Tom's like, he's like this guy, that they all appreciate.
Sort of set up the structure for
Exactly.
the 80s
Right.
where in Ohio
Right, and
there's ha-has and laughing.
Right after the strike is when the whole comedy thing broke wide open, and all of a sudden there was comedy channels, and and there was, syndicated shows, the improv this, and they got paid. If they hadn't done this, had this incident not happened and this strike taken place in the spring of 1979, maybe it would have happened at some point. Somebody would have done something. But this is what caused it to happen, because they shut down the Comedy Store on Sunset Strip. They shut it down for weeks, and they made it so that she could not operate, and they forced her to negotiate with them and begin paying them for their services. She was paying everybody else who worked in the club, the people who cleaned the toilets, the waiters, everybody, but she wasn't paying the people who were bringing in the crowds, and she literally, legitimately, in her mind anyway, her feeling was, no, this is, and there was some truth to what she was saying. She just wouldn't see their side, that she was making a lot of money and driving a nice car, and they were getting nothing, so. But the minute the strike was over, the union went away because comics and a union kind of don't go together. They're not really,
But it did set the stage really for the 80s where.
Oh yeah, totally.
And I know you don't really say you like a lot of current comedy or stand-up comics very much. I know, but I would.
I do, but I just don't want to pick them out.
Okay.
But I can tell you who I do like, though.
Yeah, who do you like?
I think Louis C.K. is brilliant.
Louis C.K.
Jim Jeffries. There's a lot of them I don't know. Who do I think of that I like?
Do you like Bill Burr?
I like Bill Burr. I know who he is. At least I know who he is. Amy Schumer, of course, is great. She can be pretty raw at times. Sarah Silverman, I love. Do
you go down to the clubs ever still at all?
I do every now and then. It's the only place I'm famous.
You wrote a book on it, right?
Yeah. I mean, I think 2/3 of the copies of I'm Dying Happy Sold were sold to comics. They all have a copy. And so, yeah, if I go into a club, it's like, oh, that's the guy. Oh, yeah. They don't want to meet me. It's funny. It's a very small world, but it's good to be famous in some little controllable group, I guess. Yeah, so I enjoy going to comics. It's still very hard for me, like it is hard for anyone to watch a comic who's bombing.
It's very uncomfortable.
Yeah, it's just I can't bear it, because I feel bad. And then every now and then, like recently, I happened to be at the Improv meeting a friend for something, and because someone said, "Oh, that's the guy that wrote 'I'm Dying Up Here," we got escorted into the back room at the Improv and seated at a table, and out walks Dave Chappelle and does an hour off the top of his head. Hysterical. I mean, just hysterical. We were like slack-jawed. I'd never seen, Dave Chappelle live, and he's just brilliant. I mean, he was as good that night as I ever saw Pryor. I mean, if you're talking about who do I think, for me,
Top of all time.
for me, Richard Pryor. He was the Van Gogh of stand-up comedy. There's never been anybody better. There's Van Gogh and Pryor and all the rest of them. Which is not to say I didn't like George Carlin, who I knew, but Richard Pryor kind of set the bar, real high. And I think that a lot of, if you really did a poll, majority of them would come out that Richard Pryor was the greatest stand-up of the last 50, 60 years anyway.
Sort of the accepted, critically acclaimed.
I would think. I could be wrong. There could be all kinds of young people say I don't know anything, and they might be right, but I don't know. There's so many comics now, you can't keep up with it. Back then, there were not that many to have to know about. Now there's hundreds.
Well, they have so many channels, too. They can go on at midnight on a game show. They can they have a lot of stuff to do.
There are people I find out who are doing very well and have very big careers who I've never heard of. And I stay up on pop culture. That's always been kind of my business, and so it's hard to keep up.
Well, Bill, thank you for talking with us. I want to open it to a little audience Q&A. Adam has this cool new furry microphone that if you raise your hand, he will throw it to you. You catch it, and you can speak into the blue box. Does anyone want to catch the microphone? Come on. Please, there we go.
And I have a question about that in a minute, Adam, when we're done here. Okay. The thinking behind throwing something that's a box shape.
But it's like a stuffed animal.
I understand, but like round.
It could be round.
You know what I mean? I would think you'd make it round, but okay.
Good feedback.
I digress. Yeah.
Sure. I really enjoyed your story about Andy Kaufman and the sidebar with Tony Clifton, of course. Tony Clifton's still around, and you still see the act. Most recently, just this year alone.
How did that happen?
Yeah, how does this happen? Sort of where my question's going. So he was on Jeff Ross Crowd Control within the last year. I think that's on CISO. And he's was at House of Blues something like a decade ago here in Los Angeles. Have you seen any of those acts? How do you think it compares, and who is that?
Well, I know who that is.
I think
and I can guarantee you that it's not Andy Kaufman.
Right.
But it's somebody who was with Andy the whole way. Okay. Who portrays that character, I don't know if I should say the name, but I know who it is, and it keeps the legend of Andy alive, and they still play with the idea that Andy still is alive. Maybe he is. It's like Elvis impersonators. It's all a tribute to Andy, and he does it out of love, and he makes money doing it. And I don't know if the joke works anymore. I mean, I guess the people who know Andy Kaufman know who Tony Clifton is. I mean, Andy's popularity was inexplicable then. Not that and I'm not saying that he wasn't talented, because he did a thing that nobody did, and he was absolutely dedicated to it. You could not get Andy to break character. He didn't care no matter what. You could have threatened to shoot his children, and he wouldn't have broken character. He was that dedicated to it. So, and there's something about it. It's still alive. I mean, my kids are in awe that I knew Andy Kaufman. I know all kinds of more famous people, but Andy Kaufman matters. The others don't,
Thank you for the question. Yeah. Follow up or no? We want to throw.
Well, just that on the Jeff Ross show, he was booed. If anything, the crowd was mostly silent. And this was a show where the whole point was to ratchet up the irritation of the audience as much as possible.
Sure.
And Tony Clifton continues to go as far over that line as possible.
Well, yeah, but you understand to the Tony Clifton character who's ever in the costume, that's applause.
That's right.
They're not there to get anyone's, isn't this great? They're there to make everybody as uncomfortable as possible and get them all upset, and then kind of realize later that, boy, that was really weird what we just participated in. That's what it is. It's an odd kind of entertainment, but it's still awful lot of really good comics are not working anymore, but Tony Clifton's still making appearances, right? Yeah. Anyone else?
Anyone else for the
wanna
blue
catch it?
cube?
Throw a box?
In the back. Nice catch.
Hey.
Hey.
So there's a Mitch Hedberg joke about something you were talking about, which is that the success path for comedy is that you're good at stand-up, and then people with money show up and ask you to do other things, like write a book or be in
Yeah,
TV.
right. I guess
So
that's true.
did these guys back in the day do this because they wanted to do stand-up, or because they wanted to be on a TV show, or both? Or
Well, it depends. There was clear differences between people. There were people who came out here, like Letterman, for example. Letterman wanted to be a writer and a performer, and he was born to do that. And he did not come out to be a stand-up comic, but he looked around and he saw real quickly, and this is in the book. I mean, he says, well, you know, I can attract the attention of people on Tonight Show by going on that stage and writing funny stuff. And, you know, he was going to write jokes and be a writer because he was a funny weatherman back in Indiana, and he was sort of a local popularity. So and there were other people like Michael Keaton, whose name was Michael something else. Michael Keaton, the actor, came out, and he changed his name to Michael Keaton because there was somebody else. And he was brilliant at stand-up comedy. I mean, he was really funny. He had a really funny act, but he really wanted to be an actor. And there was a lot more work and a lot more better paid work if you could be an actor, if you could go become a comedian. And, I mean, there's difference. The people at Saturday Night Live were not stand-up comics. There was a place on the show for stand-up comics, but stand-up's its own thing. It's funny, but it's its own thing. It's not being a comedy actor. That's a whole different game, and it's a different profession in a way. But you can make a lot more money being a sick. And a lot of stand-ups could not, weren't good actors. Jay Leno he wouldn't admit it back then, but eventually he wasn't a good actor. He wasn't particularly. It's not what he was comfortable doing. He was naturally gifted at being a comedian, and believe me, when Jay Leno was 27, 28 years old and he was performing on the comedy show, he was fall down funny all the time. And he could get up there and talk and go off the top of his head for hours. You know, he was amazing. The guy you saw on the Tonight Show during those years he was doing that show for them, for NBC. But Leno on stage in the comedy club is a different thing altogether. He was really good at that, and he wasn't a good actor. And Letterman was great at being a broadcaster and talking to people and being funny, and he was great at that. So there was, and a lot of them became actors, and they became writers and producers, and they were in the business of funny, but they didn't go on with the stand-up. And a whole bunch of them that you don't ever know after this strike was over and they started getting paid, went on the road for the next 5 or 6 years and made pretty good money. Traveling around, until they got tired of doing that and, doing one-nighters in little water tank towns around America because comedy was real simple and real inexpensive to put on. You needed a couple chairs, a couple microphones, that's all you need. You didn't need a sound system of any particular, you didn't need to pay the band, you didn't need to pay for music, this was it. So, the comic walked away with most of the performing money, so they get paid pretty well. And it's what it's what they were compelled to do. And most of them, and I would say that all of them were compelled to do it, meaning there wasn't any way that you could have stopped them from doing it, as hard as some people tried.
Any other questions? I think we have time for a couple more. If anyone want to catch the blue cube? Here we go, up front. Make it a good toss. Nice.
So, can you expand more on High Times?
High Times.
On the title of the book.
Well, yeah, there was drugs. Although this was, again, the comedians at the time, they weren't getting paid. Okay, so there wasn't a lot of coke that you can buy, and this was sort of right when coke was coming in, and all of them pretty much that, if you hung out around Mitzi and you were part of her favorite and you were part of the crowd around Richard Lewis, you got free coke. And that's in the book. I don't want to go. That's not a major story, but I mean, you couldn't stand outside the Comedy Store for very long without somebody handing you a joint, But when coke came in, it was kind of a separator, because, I was in Hollywood and show business around it anyway back at the time, and there was a changeover from marijuana to coke. back then. I mean, marijuana, you hand it around to people. Nobody handed around coke because you couldn't afford it. So if you want to do coke, you went in the bathroom with your best friend. And everybody else was kind of pissed. So it was, there was no camaraderie around doing cocaine. So it wasn't a big thing with the comics because, again, most of them couldn't afford it.
And it's touched on in the show, too. I mean, pretty prevalent.
I mean, and you know what? All of them, this is not me doing some sort of 12-step thing, but most of them who got involved with coke, it didn't end well. They all ended up in rehab. They all derailed all their lives. Richard Pryor ended up dead. And burned himself very short time after this. You could see it coming. And he. So yeah, it didn't help anybody's comedy. That's for sure. Marijuana, I don't think it had any effect one way or the other, but maybe it helped some and
helped Rodney Dangerfield.
Yeah, I remember a scene with Rodney. I had a scene with Rodney Dangerfield. I was sitting in the Comedy Store. It's talking to Rodney Dangerfield and Joey. Remember the guy from Car 54? Where are you? Ooh, that guy. He was an actor. Anyway, but they were.
I'm not that old.
I was at L.A. Times reporter, and they handed me a joint, and I had to go thanks, but I handed it on, sort of a weird moment.
With those two guys?
Yeah, with those two guys in the Comedy Store, with the people all around them, So yeah, that happened a lot of times, but later, I never inhaled.
Anyone else? We have a few, or we can call it a wrap. Does anyone have another question for the Fuzzy Cube?
I just want to correct, it was Big J. Okerson, not Jeff Ross, the show.
Oh, I know who Jeff Ross is. I don't know who the other guy is.
Big J. Okerson
I wanted to get his name out there.
was the show where Tony Clifton performed.
The show where Tony Clifton was on.
Oh, yeah,
you.
okay. It's not Andy, just so you know. I guess whoever it was, that's not Andy. Andy is dead.
We can't reveal who.
I'm not saying he won't come back.
I think you can Google it and find out who it is.
Donald Trump became president, so Andy Kaufman could come back.
Google it. You can find out who it is. I don't. But or find me after. Okay, yeah. Leave the mystery.
Okay. All right.
Great.
Anybody else? This is your last chance.
Going once. Going twice.
Nobody wants to know what my favorite craft beer is? No.
Yes.
Oh, before we do, stop it. Though.
Last time
what is your next project? Your next book?
My next project is a book that should be out within the next year. It's called Fins, and it's about the birth of the car business. As told through the life of a guy named Harley Earl who invented the profession of automobile styling, and he took General Motors from being this little bitty company to the most successful corporation in the world because he figured out a way for them to change their cars every year, the look of them. And he also was the guy who put fins on cars in the 1950s. So that's
Nice. When is that? When do you expect that to be?
supposed to come out in January of 2018 if I can finish it in the next couple days.
All right, well, we better let you go then. Thanks for coming. We'll let you go finish
Thanks,
your
guys.
latest
Thank
book.
you, everybody.
All right, thank you.